Welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us. Benjamin Netanyahu has signaled that what he calls the intense phase of Israel's military operations against Hamas in Gaza is drawing to a close. But the Israeli Prime Minister says the fighting won't stop until the group no longer controls the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel's declared aim in the war is to eliminate Hamas and liberate the Israeli hostages held by militant groups. It's an aim Israel has not achieved. But the Israeli military chief of staff says the structure of Hamas in the city of Rafah is nearly dismantled. Israel's military now appears to be shifting its focus to its northern border, where clashes with Lebanon's Hezbollah militia have been intensifying.
Applause for Benjamin Netanyahu, despite the political headwind he's facing both at home and abroad. But his message will likely disappoint those pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza and the speedy return of Israeli hostages.
If there is an agreement, it will be an agreement according to our terms. And our terms are not to end the war, to leave Gaza and Hamas as it is. I refuse to leave Hamas as it is. We need to eliminate it.
As fighting along Israel's border with Lebanon heats up, the Prime Minister signalled Israel could scale back its operation in Gaza.
After the intense phase is finished, we will have the possibility to move part of our forces north. And we will do this, first and foremost, for defensive purposes.
Cross-border tensions have continued to rise since the outbreak of the war, with Israel repeatedly striking the Iran-backed Hezbollah militia over the weekend. International observers have called for restraint, warning an open conflict could trigger a wider war in the Middle East. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is currently meeting with US officials. Before leaving for Washington, he told the press,
"In these meetings, I will discuss developments on the Gaza front, the Lebanon front, and they have a crucial importance at this time. We are prepared for any action that may be required in Gaza, Lebanon, and in other places as well."
Anger in Israel over the government's handling of the war continues to grow. Over the weekend, protesters rallied near the headquarters of Netanyahu's Likud party, the biggest so far, according to organisers, demanding the return of all hostages and an immediate ceasefire. Meanwhile, civilians in Gaza continue to get caught in the crossfire. 4 Palestinians, including a child, among the latest victims of Israeli shelling on central Gaza on Monday.
And we can now talk to Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's the director of the Counter Extremism Project here in Berlin. Welcome. It's so great to have you in the studio. Now, Israel's stated goal going into this war was to eliminate Hamas in Gaza and to liberate the hostages. None of that has really happened, has it? So what has this intense phase of the war, as Netanyahu is calling it, really achieved?
Well, there have been some successes, but really not really any sustained approach of these two core aims. So, of course, they have killed a lot of Hamas fighters. Of course, they have broken some of the tunnel system, not all of it. They have definitely eliminated a large parts of the weapons, rockets, and armed storages of Hamas, but they haven't gotten the 2 leaders, Dave and Sinwar, and they still have about 100 Israeli hostages in Gaza. So if they would leave now, Hamas would be back within a month, unfortunately. So what it only can mean is a refocus of troops away from the Gaza Strip to the north, but a continuing military operation in Gaza Strip at the lower level.
Yeah, and we heard a military official today saying that Israel is close to dismantling the Rafah brigade. Now, from someone who knows this conflict very well, are those traditional military structures really the way that Hamas functions?
Well, Hamas had built up a military structure, but it's not like a brigade it would be in the German army or in the US army. So it is a organized group of fighters, and the Rafah brigade was really the last brigade in inverted commas that Israel hadn't tackled yet. But that doesn't mean all of these Hamas fighters of these various brigades that they've dismantled before are either in captivity or dead. It's still a loose connected cell network of Hamas that really fights back on a daily basis against Israel, and a couple of weeks ago was even able to fire rockets at Tel Aviv again.
So what does it mean then that they dismantled the brigade? Then in the north, they said they had completed their mission in a sense. Now they're popping back up again. It seems like they're playing a very sinister game of whack-a-mole there. How can they move forward in an effective way and move towards achieving that stated goal? Is it even possible the way they're going about it right now?
Well, the Israeli army is now encountering exactly the same challenges that the international forces had in Afghanistan or the American and British forces had in Iraq, is that you cannot just clear an area of terrorist or insurgents elements. You need to hold that area now, and then afterwards you need to administer that area. And they've been very good at the clearing of the areas. They have been partially good at holding of the areas, but since they have a limited troop numbers, they had always had to move troops out. So what of course happened was that Hamas fighters simply pushed into these newly cleared areas back into these areas which they had been before, and the Israelis had now left. So this clear, hold and administer step wasn't really done. So yes, they've cleared the northern Gaza. Yes, they've cleared now Rafah, but that doesn't mean that Hamas won't be back as soon as they leave these areas. And if Israel has now decided that they have to concentrate more forces in the north because Hezbollah has increased its attack, it's playing into Hamas's hands. And it's playing into Hezbollah's hands because that's exactly what both groups want them to do.
Mm-hmm. This all started in response to the October 7th terror attacks. It has brought incredible hardship to the people of Gaza. Now, has Hamas lost support over their role in making what is taking place in Rafah and all across the Strip happen in triggering?
Polls are very difficult, but there has one by the Palestinian Research Center just recently, which clearly shows that now Fatah has greater support in Gaza Strip than Hamas does, but Hamas has greater support in the West Bank than Fatah has. So it has lost support, but that doesn't mean that there would be, at this point, a viable idea of who is governing Gaza if it's not Israeli occupied at the end of all of this. And that means there's a question who is going to be the biggest power factor in Gaza once the Israeli army would completely withdraw or mostly withdraw. And at the moment still, the only viable power structure that would very likely take over again is Hamas. So we're not at the end of this at all.
Mm-hmm. I want to look at the day after in a second, but first, what do you consider to be Hamas's biggest source of power at this point? Is it popular support still? Is it something else?
It's its willingness to accept as many Palestinian casualties as it takes. This was the strategy from the very beginning, to make this an extremely bloody conflict for the Israeli government, make the Israeli government lose international support, increase the pressure on the Israeli government so that they have to stop before their back is truly broken in the Gaza Strip. And looking at today's announcement, I'm wondering whether this is not a strategy that will, in the end, maybe work out.
Mm-hmm. That is very interesting. How could you see it working out then in their favor?
Well, if Israel really now starts a major military operation in Lebanon against Hezbollah, and we've seen this in 2006, what kind of resources it takes, because Hezbollah is truly an army which has actual brigades, which has far more rockets, far more ballistic missiles, and has developed a low-flying, high-speed drone that evades the Iron Dome. We having a completely different military scenario that we had in Gaza, where it's more an insurgency warfare. This is an actual conventional confrontation, which means most of the military energy will go to the north, will go to Lebanon. Lebanon will, again, like in 2006, experience major destruction, including in Beirut, because that's where Hezbollah's center of gravity is. But that also means Gaza will get less attention. And then we may be back at the point where we were in October 6th, which would be a tragic outcome.
Yeah. You say there needs to be a plan for governance for Gaza. Looking at the past, how have terror groups like Hamas been taken out effectively? Was it through diplomacy in the end?
There were a couple of examples where, like in the Irish Republic, the IRA was brought into a peace process. Now, the problem with a religious ideology like Hamas has is there is no political process to be had. This is a extremist organization whose ideology is comparable to that of Al-Qaeda. It doesn't have a global plan at this point, but certainly wants to have an Islamic State in Gaza. So there is no negotiation you can have with someone who has a religious ideology. The other ability to dry out terror organizations is simply by providing governance that is taking away the social support. Yeah. And in this case, it could only be Palestinian governance, but the PNA is very historically weak at this point. So that doesn't seem like a viable option. Only remaining option is then international control, the Arab Union or the UN getting control over the Gaza Strip and managing until a newly established Palestinian Authority could take over.
Hans-Jakob Schindler, thank you so much.
Thank you.
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has repeated her calls for a two-state solution during a visit to Israel, her 8th since the beginning of the war. In a policy speech, she focused on the war in Gaza as well as the worsening humanitarian crisis in the Strip. While reiterating that she was a friend of Israel, the foreign minister criticized Israel over its approach to the war. Baerbock also spoke of the impact the images of the war were having around the world.
These images from Gaza are traveling the globe, sparking strong emotions in the Arab world, but also in the US, in Europe, in my country, everywhere. Disbelief, sadness, anger. And as a friend of Israel, I want to be frank. This anger is not helping Israel to meet its security needs. To the contrary, it only serves Hamas' cynical drive to provoke further escalation.
Our political editor, Michaela Küfner, is accompanying the foreign minister on her trip, and I asked her whether Baerbock's words mark a shift in Germany's position in the conflict.
No, Germany is clearly not departing from its path, being close at Israel's side, having declared Israel's security as reason of state, of one of its fundamental principles of the German state. But what Annalena Baerbock is doing here in Tel Aviv is mapping out that being a friend means telling your friend that some things might be bad news. She's unusually outspoken here, talking about a longer lasting peace being what Germany strives for in this friendship, and that also means for Israel to recognize that there is global anger, as she called it, at the high number of civilian casualties in Gaza, and that is something that needs to be factored in. She also, interestingly, on a par with the US ambassador here, is calling for a longer-term plan, telling Israel to listen to Arab voices who vowed to also help rebuild Gaza, but only if there is a path to a lasting peace, a two-state solution. She also calls out very uneasy issues like the allegations of torture against Israel, and calls on Israel to show that it lives up to its democratic values and to international human rights law. She's unusually specific in her criticism, while at the same time stressing that Germany remains at Israel's side. But clearly, together with the United States, Germany wants to see some movement, not just in the Netanyahu government, but also in how Israel thinks about its own future and its chances for a longer lasting peace.